The square root of a perfect square. So a couple of terms there, square root and of course perfect square. So let's start off with those two. First of all, the square root is going to have the radical and then a number underneath the radical, which is called the radicand, if that's important. But the square root is really asking us a question. The question that it is asking is, it is saying what number times itself is 25. So that's the question it's being asked. What number when multiplied with itself gives us 25? And if we think back to our times tables, we know that, well, 5 times itself is 25. So the square root of 25 is 5. Now, the perfect square part of this means that the square roots are always going to be numbers that are themselves perfect squares. So for example, 25 is a perfect square because 5 squared is 25. So just to list out a couple of those, keep in mind 1 squared is 1, 2 squared 4, 3 squared 9, 4 squared 16, 5 squared, the one that we just did, is 25, 6 squared 36. I'll just give a couple more. 7 squared is 49 and 8 squared is 64. So these are well worth memorizing if you haven't already in your times tables. Let's do one more example here. Let's do the square root of 64, which again, 64 is a perfect square. And if I look back over here, 8 squared is 64. So when we ask ourselves that question, what number times itself is 64, looking back over here I can see that 8 times itself is 64. So the square root of 64 is 8. And now for our problem, the square root of a perfect square, what number is equal to the square root of 16? Looking back again in our table of perfect squares that we made, we see that 4 squared is 16. So 4 times itself is 16. So the square root of 16 is 4. It's important, notice that we no longer write the square on there because in fact the square root has kind of negated that squaring. So we drop the 2 when it comes to the perfect squares, and the square root of 16 is just 4. Again, remember that question, what number times itself is 16? 4 times itself is 16.